afternoon. Welcome to Curator's Corner. I'm Amanda Olkey, Director of Adult Education at the International Spy Museum in Washington, D.C. We know it's a difficult time for our country, but we are still here to educate and engage you. Informed minds, whether about history or current affairs, are what we need now. So, thank you for joining us for an exploration of World War II escape and evasion. Dr. Alexis Albion, our curator of special exhibits, will be leading this discussion with Phil Froom. Phil is a Spy Museum Advisory Board member and the expert in all things escape and evasion. So without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to two incredibly interesting people.
Hello, Phil. Thanks for being here today. I just wanted to give a little plug for Phil's book, which I have here. It's gigantic and it's very heavy and it's beautiful. So if anybody is interested in this topic, or even if you're not, I really encourage you to have a look at Phil's book. It's got fantastic glossy photos. It's got amazing information about this topic of evasion and escape. One thing I learned was that we should call it evasion and escape, because evasion comes before the escape. I don't know why, but my brain always wants to say escape and evasion. It just sounds better, but evasion and escape. So fantastic book, available at the Spy Museum bookstore and all good bookstores. Right, well, as I said, we've got Phil here. Phil's been a great friend to the Spy Museum for a number of years now. When you go to the Spy Museum, in our Tools of the Trade exhibit, you will see a whole little exhibit there about evasion and escape. One of the great artifacts there is on loan to the museum from Phil. We'll be talking about that today. We have a number of other artifacts spread throughout the museum on this topic. But today we're going to be looking at some great artifacts from our collection at the museum, also from Phil's collection and others, and it's going to be interesting. So, Phil, are you ready to get this thing going?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Alexis.
Right. So, sorry. First thing I thought we might actually talk about is why prisoners. No, we're talking about artifacts here that were used to help people escape, help soldiers during World War II escape and evade being captured. And I wonder, it was interesting to me when I was actually looking at your book, just kind of go back and think of some of the reasons why people actually would escape, or why it was important to try to help soldiers escape. So I thought we might just kind of talk through that at the beginning.
Yeah, it's actually an interesting question, because you know, we think of escaping being the duty of all officers, all military personnel. It's actually an urban myth. It was never a duty. It was never mandated. You couldn't have been penalized for not having escaped. And if you think about it, a lot of the early prisoners, you know, we in the UK lost quite a lot after Dunkirk, after the British forces evacuated from France. So we lost about 50,000 there, which was probably the initial amount. But then a great many others were aircrew, obviously shot down over occupied Europe. And you've really got to think about how these guys got there. They were predominantly in bomber aircraft. They were shot down by the enemy by whatever means, and then had to go through a traumatic escape from almost certainly a burning aircraft. Their friends in the aircraft will have been killed or badly wounded, and on average, from a British 4-engine Lancaster bomber, 3 got out of a 7-man crew. And then, of course, when US Air Force came across in 42, your B-17s and B-24s, 10 men per crew, and similar. The numbers were quite low, the guys that got out. So you've then got to think, they bailed out, they survived, they were captured, now they're in a POW camp, and frankly, life is pretty fine now. Nobody's trying to kill them anymore. So you've really got to question, why would you want to escape?
Right, right.
But having said that, yeah, I mean, if we move forward to really one of the reasons, I think it was morale as much as anything. You know, having something to do, I think, was an important thing. Whether you were digging escape tunnels or making escape material or copying maps or whatever you were doing, just being occupied. You know, some of the guys that we lost in '39 were there for 6 years. You know, that's a long time to be cooped up, although under COVID-19, it feels like 6 years already. But I mean, you know, realistically, that was a long time. So escaping became really an occupation of any of those that had a good idea. And
one of the other things that was interesting to me when I was looking through your book was that they really put a premium on getting these guys back because, you know, they needed the men. They were trained. It was important. They couldn't waste those resources.
yeah, I mean, that's true. Certainly, as I said, most of after the British forces were evacuated from mainland Europe, our only way of striking back was via commando raids, of which there were a fair few, but then through air operations. And you know, a fighter pilot learns to fly a single engine aircraft. It's complicated, but not that complicated. But then you're teaching young 19-year-old guys to fly 4-engine bombers, and that takes a long time. So as we began to lose more and more and more aircrew, bearing in mind that we lost 55,000 killed during World War II, yeah, we needed to get them back. But you know, manpower cuts both ways. We needed our trained pilots back, but equally we were tying up huge amounts of German troops guarding prisoners of war camps. So the longer the war went on, you know, eventually I think we had 264,000 Allied POWs in Europe, and on average,
the last reason, well, I can do this. Sports intelligence.
yeah, and to be honest, we learned this very, very late on in World War I, that we really had neglected using any form of intelligence from returning prisoners of war, whether they escaped or whether they were somehow repatriated. So early in World War II, we thought about this and thought, well, this is another very important thing that we must start teaching our troops is, as you're a prisoner, observe everything. As you're captured, as you're moved to the camps, as you're moved around the camps, and bearing in mind that, again, a lot of air crew were imprisoned in Luftwaffe camps, German Air Force camps, which were often co-located with airfields. So just being able to report back the types of aircraft, the movements, the losses, all good intelligence.
Well, let's move on to the really fascinating stuff here, which are these organizations that were set up especially to help prisoners evade and escape. So MI9 is a British organization. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so MI9 was stood up on the 23rd of December 1939. There was a fair amount of preparation and hangover from World War I, where we decided we needed to do this. We should have done it. We didn't, so we will do it. It was led by a First World War major who he'd been wounded a number of times. He'd been at the front line. He knew what troops in the front line faced. And then he gradually built an eclectic group of personnel from all different parts of the military. A number of them were World War I escapers and evaders, so they had the knowledge. And then others, certainly the chap we'll talk about later on, he just had an interest in escapology, and that's what got him the job. But it turned out he was the right guy for the job. So yeah, MI9 obviously went right through to the end of the war, based initially in London, but their HQ was bombed, so they moved out to Wilton Park in Buckinghamshire, as it says here. And then they were really responsible for Europe, North Africa, Middle East, India, Burma, Thailand, and Malaya. So then in '42, US Air Force came to Britain. 8th Air Force started to fly missions over Europe. And MI9 got together with the evolving MIS-X, based at Fort Hunt, Virginia, pretty close to where you are now. And MI9 passed on everything. It's kind of unusual sometimes for intelligence agencies to share and totally share, but in this case, everything was passed across to MIS-X. They had meetings in Washington. The MIS-X team came to London, and everything was handed over to them that we'd achieved so far. And from that point on, Ms. X established in the US and began to grow, and they took responsibility for other parts of the world where the US was much more predominant, the Pacific mainly.
Now you mentioned, oh, I have gone too far. This, didn't mention him by name, but you mentioned him in passing, this gentleman who was the genius behind much of MI9's output.
Yes, Christopher Clayton Hutton. He was a First World War infantry officer with the Yorkshire Regiment. He then transferred to the Royal Flying Corps, the forerunner of the RAF. And in his uniform there, you can see actually he's wearing the rank of a British captain. The collar badges signify he was in the Intelligence Corps, but you can see he's wearing his RAF wings and his First World War ribbons. So he'd also been there. But this is the guy. He was absolutely eccentric, and as you read through even the archives, this becomes apparent. But he was inspired. He always had an interest in escapology. He met Harry Houdini, actually challenged Harry Houdini on a task when it came to his town of Birmingham in the UK. He had the opportunity of winning £100 if he beat Houdini, and he didn't. But
but you beat him in escaping during a certain period of time. Was that what it was? Or...
He built an enclosure which hopefully Houdini couldn't escape from, and Houdini did. Turns out he cheated, but he still escaped, and so Clayton Hutton didn't get his money. But yes, Clayton Hutton tried to rejoin the Air Force after the First World War into the Second War. Couldn't. He was too old. In the end, he heard about a job in London, went and interviewed with MI9, not knowing anything about the job. And at the very end of the interview, happened to mention his interest in escapology, and everybody went, "Oh, tell us more." And that literally was what got him the job. And then from that point on, he began to invent, or at least adopt, many of the escape gadgets that became common across all the forces during the war. You see there.
Let's look at some of those gadgets.
Yeah, I mean,
so let's start with some beautiful maps.
Yeah, well, he spoke to First World War escapers and said, "What did you need?" And the two things, obviously, anyone needs to navigate by are maps and compasses. So he began to produce maps. He turned to a number of printers in the UK, but he wanted them to print maps on silk, because obviously paper maps were no good in the field. Any of you out there that have served in the military know that paper maps get wet and they just turn to paper mache if you're in the field for sustained periods. So obviously, if you're evading across Europe on foot in winter, you couldn't use paper maps. So long story short, after much trial and error, he came up with the way of mass producing silk maps. One of the ones you see there, this was a special one. They weren't all as detailed as this, but this is of a port of Danzig, now in Poland, but then in Germany. And the reason this port was important was because neutral ships docked there, ships specifically from Sweden. It even marks, you can't quite see on the detail, but on one of those port areas, it marks neutral ships here. So that was an opportunity. If you could escape to Danzig, you could board a neutral ship, get to Sweden, get home.
These some other maps, I think, at least I know the middle one is in our collection, and they're all made with different material. The middle one is especially interesting to me because it's made out of mulberry paper, which I'm not quite sure what you do. Squish up mulberries and I guess make some kind of paper out of it, and I guess it's extremely thin but durable.
Yeah, I mean I personally think the mulberry maps are much more interesting. They are gossamer thin. They are absolutely thinner than normal tissue, and extremely strong. I tested a damaged one that I bought once, and literally if I take hold of it and pull it like this, it doesn't tear. If it gets wet, you can flatten it out and it will just dry out and it'll be perfect. But yes, it was made from the pulp from mulberry leaves, and this is the same paper that the Japanese people use as walls in their houses. You know, some of them have paper walls. and it's extremely durable due to the way the fibers bond together. So being able to print maps on that, the big difference really between silk maps and tissue maps is that silk maps will screw down into the palm of your hand, so you could conceal them in your pockets. They were actually sewn into the linings of officers' uniforms, so that when they were shaken down by the enemy after capture, they wouldn't feel that they were carrying maps. The Mulberry maps you could fit inside a gaming dice. That's how small they pack down, and that's the big difference, concealment. The American map on the right there, sorry Alexis, the AAF map, some of the early American maps were made from balloon materials, so balloon cloth, so they were thicker, more cotton-like, but pretty durable too.
And I think the one on the left is another silk map, right?
Yeah. That's probably, that's one of the early British ones. As you can see here, that it's only 3 or 4 colors. It's pretty basic. But the later maps were full color, and really they're very beautiful objects, even now.
Now we did want to show everybody another map. Phil is actually an international television personality. He took part in a British TV show, which some people may or may not know, hosted by a man named Guy Martin, who is a very famous motorcyclist in the UK. It's a really interesting program. You can watch it on YouTube, actually, where Guy Martin actually reproduces the famous motorcycle jump from the movie The Great Escape. But he also spent some time talking to Phil, and we wanted to show you just a snippet from this episode where he's talking to Phil, and you'll see a very interesting escape map. Hannah, can we cue the film?
So there's your hanky. Obviously, all good men in smart suits have a hanky.
Yes, of course.
This again is not quite all it seems, but standard white hanky.
Right.
But if you apply a certain liquid to this,
you want me to piss on it?
Basically, yeah.
Yeah. Well, am I old? I'll be holding it. You don't want me.
No, I'm certainly not holding it. No.
I'll go around here. I'll have a slash on it down here. Are you all right? Is this all right to do this? Yeah. It's right. You're right. How's the sound? You got that?
The sound's good.
Let me get the little fella back in again. Hey? God. All right, I see now. That was a lot of piss, wasn't it? You can't just have a bit of a... There we go. There we go.
So there you've got another perfect escape map. Well, semi-perfect, bearing in mind it's a developer.
How good's that? So it needs ammonia on it?
Yeah.
Can you see it?
You can smell it.
Phil, hang on. Phil, that looks like it was quite a bit of fun.
Yeah, it was in a funny sort of way. I mean, he's a very funny guy, and I guess a lot of our American colleagues don't know him, but he does a lot of military oriented programs, and he's just a very funny guy. But yeah, I mean, that was a genuine type of escape map sent in just as a hanky, nicely tied up with with lace or whatever, but if developed, produced another escape map.
Now I'm going to go back to our presentation. Here we've got a whole bunch of compasses.
Yeah, so
some of these, what's the most interesting?
Well, obviously after Clayton Hutton had developed his maps, then the other thing you need is a compass. So he began by producing the very simplest of compass, which is called a swinger, and we'll see one of those later on. Why is it called the swinger? Well, because it's just a compass needle, and if you suspend it on cotton, it's magnetized and it swings to north. So that's why. Those were very easy to conceal, but gradually throughout the war, he produced more and more different types of compass. Looking at them top left onwards. The one top left actually is an American escape compass used by US Air Force. It was made by Mulberry Button Company, but you can see it says on it Hamilton Aero, who are the people that actually adapted it to be an escape compass. They were much simpler than the British compasses, probably quicker to make, but they were much easier to find. So once they'd been discovered, they were pretty easy to discover thereafter. But then next to it, next to the postage stamp, is one of the smaller ones. You can see there the three component parts, but then a complete one underneath. That's a standard small-sized postage stamp. So, that's about a 4mm compass, tiny things. So late in the war, you can see directly beneath that. It's concealed in the top of a pen. You can just see it there by the pen clip. They concealed it even in cigarettes, individual cigarettes and cigars. On the right, a pair of cufflinks worn by RAF officers, if captured, probably wouldn't arouse much suspicion. They were actually normally painted. The dark bar on the left of the top one and the right on the bottom one, that was typically painted a different color. Those ones perhaps didn't get as far as finished production. Beneath that is a collar stud. Back in wartime, collars were detachable from shirts, and you wore a stud in the front there to hold the collar together. And you can see there a tiny little compass that screws into the back of that collar stud. They were worn by aircrew, again by all ranks, not just officers. This is a slightly unusual one. It's possibly SOE. It may not be an MI9 one. These standard MI9 ones had a glass front that was larger, but they were painted white. So even if you took them off and looked at them, it just looked like a collar stud. We've talked about the pen. Clayton Hutton produced an escape pen with all sorts of gadgets in it. The compass there, another compass was hidden in the top. The pen clip was magnetized, so it could be used as a compass needle. And he hid dyes inside the ink bowl so that you could actually dye uniforms in the camps. Then to the left at the bottom, the black buttons there, they are fly button compasses worn by all services. They comprise two different buttons. You can see there, one is balanced on top of the other. The bottom one had a spike, the top one balanced on the spike. The two dots are north, the single dot is south, and it would swing to north as a compass.
And when you say fly button, you're talking about your flies, right? Is it?
Yeah.
Right. Well, so we've got a fantastic array of compasses. Did you get to the belt buckle one? Did you cover that one yet?
No, that's the last one. So the center left was a British battle dress uniform buckle. It was sewn into the uniform, and you can see there a little spike that came up, a little boat-shaped compass needle. All of that was enclosed very neatly, sewn into the uniform, and once needed, it could be torn off the uniform and then used as a compass. So really ingenious, very, very clever.
I'm going to move on to these next. Now, these are images of the same object, right? And the one on the left you can see has this pouch on the top, and it's been removed in the image on the right, so you can have a better view of what's underneath it. As far as I know, this is a complete escape kit, correct? Which would have been given actually to a pilot or airman of some time before they actually flew over, in case they needed it, right?
Yeah, exactly. So Clayton Hutton spoke to other colleagues from the First World War and said, okay, so we've got maps, we've got compasses, now what? And they said, well, no point having that if we haven't got any form of sustenance, because in occupied Europe in winter, you can't readily find food, and within 24 hours, you'll start to fade just from lack of sustenance. So he produced these. They were somewhat unfortunately later in life, but they were known as AIDS boxes. And this very first one, Clayton Hutton went to see the cigarette producer, H.O. Wills, and these are cigarette tins. These were called a flat 50 tin, obviously for 50 cigarettes. And he tried to buy the tins from Wills. He wanted to buy 20,000 tins, and they said no, because we want them to sell our cigarettes, so we're not selling those. So he said, okay, I'll buy 20,000 full tins, which is what he did with cigarettes as well. He sold the cigarettes to the British NAFI agency, which was, I don't know the American equivalent, but it's the agency that provided food and drink and shelter and recreation for British forces throughout the war, and even today, actually. So he sold the cigarettes at a slight profit, which paid for all the tins for free. So then he began to produce these things with malted milk tablets, which you can see on the right there, box of matches, a little tiny compass, you can see the half-inch compass, a bar of chocolate there under your pointer, and then the two envelopes. One has halazone tablets in it, which were water purifying tablets, because obviously you couldn't guarantee the water you were about to drink would be pure. And the other one is benzodrine tablets, obviously to keep you alert, because for the first 48 hours, you need to get as far away from the point that you bailed out as you could, because the German cordon would begin to close in on that location. The pouch on the left is actually a rubber. Don't worry, it's a rubber drink bladder. It's a water bladder. It wasn't a great success because whilst it held a pint of water, you couldn't put it down. So you had to hang it up by that piece of string or carry it, and therefore it just wasn't a great success.
So that leads us on to the next slide, actually, right? Better way of holding water.
Yeah, exactly. So this is a late war version. The actual versions and numbers throughout the war were a little bit confusing if you read the archives, but we kind of call this a Mark V box. And the one thing that Clayton Hutton really wanted to be able to do was to provide some form of water canteen for evaders, and this was it. The image on the right there is an MI9 concept drawing of the box, and you can see actually the one at the back is full aluminum, and the one front right has a perspex clear cover and sides. So the one on the left there, the real one, is yours in the museum there. I envy you greatly, and you can see it's turned aluminum. It's probably an early version. It may well have been a trial run, because late in the war probably it wasn't easy to get hold of. And the RAF Museum in London actually has a plastic one as per the picture on the right. So we don't really know if they went into full production. I've only ever seen one of each, one of yours and the one in the RAF Museum. I've never ever seen another one anywhere globally.
Right. Now, I've heard that you've got your eye on ours, actually.
Absolutely, absolutely.
You've expressed a number of times what you would exchange to get your hands on ours, and you're not getting it.
No.
On display in the museum, it is a fantastic piece, and I love the fact that you've never actually seen one in the flesh before, and we've got it. That makes me very happy. Going on to the next slide, these are some pencil, a number of different kinds. These are ours as well. I know a lot about the one at the top, actually. Tell us about the ones at the bottom.
Yeah, so this again it was all very well producing these devices, but they had to get them to the users, and they did this in two ways really: a sort of pre-ops issuing of equipment, and obviously most aircrew carried a pencil, and when captured and searched, finding a pencil on aircrew would not have been unusual. So they used pencils to conceal a lot of things. The swinger compass that we talked about earlier, the pencil was hollowed out and swingers were hidden inside. This one, the bottom one, has a blade or a spike in it. Now this probably was more an SOE item because it's a defensive weapon, and obviously if aircrew started to use this on their captors, then they'd be put against the wall, because that becomes an act of aggression, and that's not just escaping, that's something else. But yeah, the green pencil at the top, the Cumberland pencil, you can see in the center of it there. On the lower one, there's a map. They put tissue maps. You see again how small the tissue maps can roll up. That was a full-size map that you saw earlier, and it's concealed in that pencil with a compass hidden underneath the eraser on the right.
So one of my favorite stories about the pencils on the top is that the Cumberland Pencil Factory where they were manufactured. If you go, you can actually, there's a wonderful museum in England called the Pencil Museum, where they talk all about the production of this pencil. And one thing I think is fascinating is they actually decided on the anniversary of and maybe the first manufacturing of the pencil to try and actually recreate it. And they were not able to recreate this pencil using the original tools. I believe the hole, the space in the middle of the pencil where these maps were inserted, that space was created by using a hand drill. And the people who were trying to recreate this were not able to do it. The pencils kept breaking, and they actually ended up using an electric drill, which of course they didn't use in that day. So it's still a little bit of a mystery how they were able to manufacture these just using those tools that they had at the time, which I think is just extraordinary. So let's go on to the next one. Now, what we're seeing at the bottom is actually an X-ray of the object at the top. So as you can see, the X-ray reveals something hidden inside. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so this was a MIS-X item, an American item. It was called a DES-2, the official escape aid name. And as you can see, it's a wooden comb, looks fairly innocent in the top. But inside the spine, you can see they've concealed a hacksaw blade. And obviously, one of the things you really needed if you were detained for any period of time were hacksaw blades, and they got through thousands of them. So this particular one has a hacksaw blade in it. I have one of these, also has a hacksaw blade inside, but then other combs had swinger compasses inside, other hacksaws. So combs were quite a useful, again, an innocent object carried by aircrew and soldiers every day. And provided they hadn't been discovered by the enemy initially, then these things went on for quite a long time, providing equipment.
Great. Let's go on because we've got a number of interesting things to go through. These are all, I believe, tobacco based, right? So tobacco pouch on the left, a pipe on the right, and in the middle, a lighter.
Yes, so almost everyone during the war smoked. Many people smoked pipes because they were kind of easy to get contents for, be it leftover cigarettes or be it actual tobacco. So again, MI9 produced the pouch on the left, which is a tobacco pouch. They were issued to aircrew, and you can see just inside the torn flap there, you can see a tissue map. So again, the tissue maps are so thin, if you squeeze that device, you just can't feel there's anything inside it. So it had a number of maps. There was a little tab on these things that told you what the maps were, which was typically torn off before use. And of course, if you're carrying a pipe, you'd need to carry a tobacco pouch. So again, it was quite an innocent thing. On the right, you see one of the pipes that they used. One of those 4mm compasses I showed you earlier was concealed inside the filter there that you can see, and it was hidden behind the little rubber bung that you can see on the left. And quite cleverly, they readapted the pipe so it could actually be smoked, even though the main tube was now blocked with a compass and a bung. They drilled around it so that obviously it would have been suspicious if somebody had carried a pipe for the whole day and their captors noticed he hadn't used it at all. So this was smokable. They were used. I've come across these that are completely full of tar from extended use. So they were used a lot. And then, of course, bottom left there, the cigarette lighter. And this is a slightly larger, more industrial device. There was a smaller version as well, but this one had a 1/2-inch compass hidden in the base. And like many things that MI9 devised, it had a reverse thread. So to unscrew it, you screwed it clockwise. And of course, one of the things that Clayton Hutton says in his books was that German guards were not stupid at all, but they were very ordered in that to unscrew something, you unscrewed it left. End of. You didn't think of anything else. You didn't try to do it right. If you're German, you know that everything unscrews left, and that's what they did. So consequently, these things often weren't discovered because they unscrewed right.
simple but ingenious.
Yeah.
Now there's a whole variety of things here. I think you're just showing all the interesting places where a map could be hidden. Is that correct?
Yeah, and again, these were all tissue maps. You can see the dominoes top left there, each with a tissue map inside. A thermos flask there on the right, shaving brush bottom left with a pack of maps rolled into it, and you can just see a compass in the base.
Yeah.
A pack of camels in the middle there, and you can see where it's been cut to reveal the maps inside. And then on the left there, that's a dice speaker for a game, and they actually secreted a map in the bottom and then glued it in place so you couldn't pull it apart.
We've got some more games later we'll be showing you, but this is something just a little bit different. What are all these about? Why have we got some?
Yes. So if you were shot down over occupied Europe and you managed to evade, what you really needed to do was to find a way of surviving within whatever town or village you were in without discovery. And one thing you needed, because the Germans were absolutely hard over on IDs, was a false ID. So all aircrew, this belongs to an American flyer. This guy, his name was Robert Carl. He was with the 91st Bomb Group flying out of Bassingbourn in Cambridgeshire in England. That's the base that Memphis Belle flew from, by the way. He carried these. They were all taken back in the UK, and you can see they're wearing civilian clothes. So the idea was that if you escaped from the aircraft and if you evaded, you would hopefully meet up with the resistance in whatever country you were in, and hand these over, and they would then produce you a genuine fake ID.
Here we are. There's your genuine fake ID. I think this is actually a different individual, but it's the same idea. He would have been carrying these little photographs of himself to use to make IDs if need be. I'm going to move us on because I definitely want to make sure we get to a couple of really interesting objects at the end. We've got some beautiful flying boots. These are in our collection, and I know there's some in your book as well. Again, sort of a simple but incredibly useful device for evasion, right?
Yeah, I mean, the main thing about these was that during the war, flyers wore sheepskin flying boots. Obviously, high altitudes, the aircraft weren't pressurized or warm, so they need something to keep their feet warm. Problem was, when you bailed out, typically your boots came off at the opening shock of the parachute. So now you've landed in winter in France and you have no boots, so you have a massive issue. Even if you landed with your boots, you've got flying boots on, and they were so obvious. They're great big floppy sheepskin boots. So even if you stole clothing, you still had flying boots on, and immediately people go, hang on. So Clayton Hutton devised these. As you can see, the shoe looks like a standard black brogue, and if you cut between the sheepskin upper and the lower shoe, the shoes come apart and produces a pair of black shoes for you. The sheepskin uppers can be then put together to form a waistcoat, sheepskin waistcoat to keep you warm if you need it. So the idea was you had a pair of civilian shoes that you could then evade with.
Great. These are just some wonderful photos that show, again, some of the ingenious ways they were able to transform their clothing, right? And you can these reversible jackets with all kinds of spaces there for hiding different things, I'm sure, as well, buttons and handkerchiefs and so on. I think that's pretty obvious. I just want to move on because I do want to make sure we have time for a few questions from people. Now we're on to a few games. These are in the museum as well. As you can see, pretty ordinary looking pack of playing cards, or are they ordinary?
Well, these
They're not.
Yeah, these were produced by both MI9. Initially, MI9 produced them with Waddington's in England, a gaming company who produced a lot of MI9 equipment. But then, as you can see, these are bicycle playing cards. These are Ms.X produced in the US. And what they did was they took a tissue map, but specifically manufactured, and it was cut to to fit into an entire pack of cards. And then if you soak them in water, they would come apart, as you can see there, and you ended up with all the tiles of the map. And obviously you couldn't use this map, but the idea was that it was copied. Most of the maps sent into the camps weren't actually for dispatch use, they were for copying so that everybody had one. So these were very ingenious.
Fabulous. More games. Here's a seemingly innocent Monopoly set, but not so innocent, right? These would have been sent as part of a sort of care package, right, to prisoners of war in the German camps.
Yeah, and again, this was produced by Waddington in the UK. I mean, it was produced by Parker in the US originally, but this is a wartime version. You can tell by the spinner rather than the dice. And the board is a very substantial board. I'm sure there can't be many people listening who haven't played Monopoly in their lives. And the board's quite thick and therefore lends itself to be adapted for concealments. And they concealed currency. Fake IDs was a good one here because it's a thick board and you can put quite thick documents inside it. And then small metallic objects inside. I've seen a lot of things on the web about them putting screwdrivers and compasses and all sorts. They put swingers in these because they're thin, but not much else, to be fair.
Here's a bunch of other games where you can see things have been hidden in the center there. I guess that's my favorite. It's actually was that a badminton racket or a tennis racket? Yeah.
Yeah, tennis, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. And then you can see other games there, same idea, maps and other objects actually hidden inside, part of the manufacturing process, I guess. And then some other games here. I think we've seen the dominoes before. I love the baseballs because I thought that was fascinating. That's what you're seeing in the bottom right-hand corner there, and there is an X-ray. So one of those baseballs is not like the other, and if you look at the X-ray, you can see pretty clearly the one on the right that there's something hidden inside. I'm assuming this is Miss X. Yeah,
it is. This they use these to send radio parts into the camps because some radio components you just couldn't get hold of. A lot was stolen from speakers and from other equipment in the German camps, but some of the components you just couldn't get. So they actually shipped in radio parts inside the baseballs. And obviously early on they weren't X-rayed. Later on the Germans got X-rays in the camps and it made things much harder. But yeah.
You can see that dice on top, incredible. One of the interesting things, as you said, is that they actually did cooperate with these companies to produce these games. And as you can see, the chessboard in the upper left-hand corner there actually has the Harrods label right on it. Now, this one is extraordinary. It looks like a gramophone player, a record player, right? But take it apart and ta-da! It's a radio.
Yeah, this was ingenious. This was produced by a British warrant officer aircrew member who was a radio engineer, and he built in what was called a Mark IV radio into this gramophone. All of those parts you could see are hidden underneath the turntable, so the radio couldn't be seen unless the turntable was removed. It sat out in the prisoner of war camp in complete visibility every day, but the Germans didn't look twice at it because it played records and it was a gramophone. They brought this all the way through the long marches when the Russians approached Germany, and gradually the POW camps had to fall back and march across Germany, and they carried that with them all the way, listening to the developments of the Allied troops until they got close, and they knew that soon they'd be liberated. So this came back to England, that is in the Royal Air Force Museum in London. Fantastic item.
Yeah. Well, we do have a couple of things that are related to Colditz, which of course, if people don't know, is sort of a famous castle. There's a picture of it where prisoners were sent who had managed maybe to escape from other camps, and it was supposed to be unescapable. That wasn't true, but many prisoners did try to escape. This is probably one of my favorite artifacts from the Spy Museum. Now these little tins at the top there are actually shoe polish tins that again were sent to prisoners of war in the camps as part of these care packages. They were just normal old shoe polish tins. It took me a bit of time to figure out what they were used for because I kept trying to think, what is the shoe polish used for? Shoe polish is irrelevant, right? Take out the shoe polish and then you've got a mold. And what they were used was to make these molds for Nazi insignia. You can see some of the actual sort of crude insignias that were part of Nazi uniforms on the bottom there. Oops, I can go back again. So you would fill these tins with plaster of Paris, maybe that had been scraped off of somebody's plaster cast who had broken their arm or their leg, melted down some kind of metal. I'd heard about toothpaste tubes, but I think you mentioned something else the other day that might be used. What was that? I can't remember what you mentioned.
They melted down the tinning between tin cans. They held tin cans together. The solder that held tin cans together. It wasn't solder, but you know what I mean.
Right.
To get metal to mold these from.
And if you managed to obtain somehow one of these actual Nazi insignia, press it into the plaster of Paris, fill it with the melted down metal. Voila, you've got an insignia which you'll be able to pin onto your handmade uniform, and it's good enough to maybe get past the guards at night when no one's watching properly.
Yeah, and it did. They used this method on a number of occasions. So yeah, it did work.
Now we're going to move on to our the creme de la creme. This is our last artifact we're talking about. It's the secret chess set. This is from Phil's actual collection. We're lucky enough that he loaned it to us, and it's on display in the museum. Bill, tell us about the chess set and walk us through what you found. Yeah,
so at the time I was writing my book, I met with a lot of interesting people. Some were collectors, some were family of members of MI9 or Ms.X, and I met this gentleman whose father had been in Ms.X, in MI9, and he showed me some artifacts which are very interesting. I photographed some of them. And then long after we'd first met, one day he brought this out and said, are you interested in this? And I said, well, maybe, but I'd need to investigate further. And long story short, I brought it home, took it to my local vet who'd looked after my kids' animals and actually put most of them down, I think, over a period of time. And they x-rayed it for me, which was lovely of them. And it showed me that although I couldn't see much else inside it, it certainly had a swinger compass inside. And if it had a swinger compass, it was probably an item of escape material, which is what I didn't know until that point.
Got a picture of the X-ray here, and you can see in the X-ray, that's what we're looking at, right? A swinger compass.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and actually, I don't know how well you can see that on the video, but that's the swinger compass. So it gives you the size of one of these things.
That's the one actually that you found in the chess set. That particular one.
So yeah, so we took this to the manufacturer, who still exists today. The company's called Jakes of London. They're the oldest gaming company in the world. They've been around since 1795, and throughout the war they produced huge amount of games that were equipped for MI9.
I think if we go on to the next one, we can see, right, this is the back of the chess set. And there's there's the label.
Yep.
Yep.
John Jakes and Son. So
yep.
Yes, they have one of their specialists come in, and he very, very carefully pared off the green bays on the back, which you can see in that left-hand picture. It took him probably an hour just to do that, and then he began to cut into the set. That actually is after we cut into it. So there's the picture of just after he'd finished removing the bays. And then you can see in the image on the left, well, even better there, you can see as we began to get into it. And then finally, inside, we found a little black waterproof pouch, which you can see on the right there, and a number of tissue maps and German currency and the swinger. So this was a complete escape kit, really. You had the compass, you had the maps, and you had some currency to either bribe your way or to buy train tickets and things like that. So a complete MI9 escape kit, which was just fantastic. And as you say, it's now exhibited at the museum, which is, I think, the best place for it. It's great that people could see it.
We're so happy to have it, and I'm happy to have you. And oh, we threw in here a few actual photos from Colditz here, actually. So many people are trying to escape. They actually set up an escape museum within the castle, and what we're seeing here are some photographs from that. Over on the right here is sort of one of the most famous escape stories, right? The gentleman who, just like in the movies, tied his bed sheet together. In fact, if we zoom in here, you can see there are the bed sheets there. So people did manage to escape from the unescapable Colditz. I know you wanted to acknowledge just a few of the people who provided some of these images and artifacts, but we don't have that much longer, but we have time for a few questions.
Okay.
I'm going to hand that back over to Amanda.
Hi, we've been getting some really interesting questions because there were really interesting things on display. Thank you for both for talking about it. Early questions stimulated by the maps. How broadly did everyone get issued these? How many, like who got issued these kind of escape things? How widely and how often?
So all aircrew were issued with what they called a maps purse or an escape purse, which had maps of the territory they were flying over and currency for that territory too. So if they flew over France, over Holland to bomb Germany, then they'd have maps and currency for France and Holland, and potentially maps of Germany too. Special forces units, all the commando units were issued them. And then on D-Day, the 101st and 82nd Airborne guys who jumped into Normandy, they were all issued with them as well.
Cool. Do we know anything about what the Germans issued to their soldiers?
Almost nothing, interestingly.
Wow.
The German Air Force were very, very good at survival equipment. Their crews had some really good survival equipment in their aircraft, but there was almost no escape kit issued to them at all. If German aircrew was shot down over Britain during the Second War, their chances of escape were zero. Nobody escaped from Britain back to Europe. So therefore, giving them that kit just was pointless, because all of the British public were hostile to enemy flyers, whereas in occupied Europe, every country was occupied by the Nazis and therefore were hostile to the Nazis and were willing to help. So the kit was useful for us there because we could use it to get to an escape line, and people would help our people escape.
That's so interesting. Someone wants to know what the swinger compass is made of and how did it work? I know I couldn't use one.
It's made of stamped steel, and if you see in the center of it as a little tiny hole, that had a piece of cotton tied on it, and it was suspended from the cotton, and it just swung north because it's magnetized. So it's actually a compass needle without the compass wrapped around it, in effect.
Once again, I would not be able to use it.
I'm sure you would.
How many of these ideas translated into, follow-up conflicts? Are any of them, do you think, still in use today? You've had this training not that long ago.
Nice of you to say so, but quite a while. Yeah, it's still issued today. Pretty well everything that MI9 came up with in World War II moved forward through Korea, through Vietnam, through conflicts that we've had, and certainly in aircraft ejector seats today, survival and escape kits are still provided. The silk maps are still provided. What they call blood chits, which is a multilingual map and a phrase that says in multiple languages where you would be flying. I'm not here to do you harm. I'm a member of the US Air Force. I've been shot down. Please help me and you will be paid. They're still carried today. They're carried in Afghanistan. They were carried in a rack. They're carried by all air crew.
If you had one item that you could have available to you for an escape, what would it be?
Wow, that's a difficult one.
I
think
would
if
have
I was
cash.
yeah, funny you should say that. Yeah. Yeah, I think if it had to be one escape item, it would have to be the compass, because you can navigate in a direction with a compass, but you don't need the map. But if you have a map and you can't orientate yourself to north, and you got to remember, most aircrew in World War II were volunteers. They weren't professional navigators. You know, a lot of them had been furniture salesmen 6 months before. So shot down over Germany, you land there, you've got no idea that the sun rises in the east and sets in the west, or that the moss down a certain side of a tree gives you a direction of the prevailing wind in Europe, etc. So I think having a compass, and you would know, well, I've been shot down in Holland, I know where France is in my head, let's head that way. So I think that would be the most useful thing. But money work.
So I'd get a compass and a map.
Ah, well, that's cheating. You got 2 items.
Said one.
Is there any gadget or device that you have dreamed of seeing or getting your hands on that has evaded you?
Yeah, there are some. There are a number of images from a book produced by MI9 in 1942, which we think were given to the US MIS-X, which had all their devices in, and there's a number of items in there. There are some special tools that were produced with escape aids inside, really cool things, and they will have been either used after the war until they were destroyed, or just discarded. When people were repatriated, they left most of the equipment there. So I've never seen any of these things ever. So yeah, some of those would be real nice.
Is a music record, right?
Yeah.
Which actually has inside it, I think maps or something like that. And I don't know if any of those exist anymore, but
Yeah,
that would be amazing. Yeah. Do they have some of it?
Yeah, the RAF Museum in London has a couple. Yeah, I'd love one of those, because they're attractive items. You could frame those and put them on the wall with the currency inside and the old gramophone record around it. It'd be really nice. So yeah, I like these things.
We are asked if there are any interesting shibboleths for escape or capture of enemies. I had to refresh my memory on shibboleth, meaning, I guess, customs around escape or capture of enemies.
I don't know, really. I mean, certainly in Western Europe, the Geneva Convention applied. So we treated German prisoners as well as they treated us sometimes better. Unfortunately, in the Far East, some of the enemy forces in the Far East didn't follow the Geneva Convention and killed thousands and thousands of our prisoners quite brutally. So I think being captured in the Far East, all bets were off. Being captured in Western Europe, you had a pretty good chance of surviving. There were stories, well, documented stories of aircrew being killed after bombing raids in Germany late in the war, when Arab joint air forces were decimating German cities. There were crews that bailed out and were then beaten to death by the enemy. But generally that didn't happen. Generally they treated us well.
One thing I found quite interesting myself was that not only were they complying with the Geneva Conventions, for example, by allowing these Red Cross packages to come prisoner of war camps and from other charities as well. And of course, this is one way MI9 and MIS-X managed to sneak in all these great devices. But I mean, it was economically to the benefit of the Germans as well, because they were getting, otherwise they'd have to provide them with uniforms and forms of entertainment and so on. So for them, it was actually a cost-saving measure to let other people provide these things. So I'd never thought about that before. It was very interesting.
Well, it was, but something I've never understood is that they had so many escapes using gadgets supplied by MI9 and Ms. X. Why didn't they just stop all parcels that weren't Red Cross? Because Red Cross parcels were never tampered with by MI9 or Ms. X, because if they were discovered to contain escape material, then the Germans would have banned them. And as you rightly say, then a lot of our prisoners could well have starved late in the war when Germany was, out of food, out of everything. But prior to that, so much came in through MI9 parcels and Ms. X parcels that if the Germans had just said no more, it would have stopped, and they never did that. So I guess that's a good thing for us and a shame for them, really.
I'm going to ask one final question. Any recommendations for books that you love of the real escapes?
Yeah, there's a lot actually. There's a good one called Shutdown and on the Run. I can't remember the name of the author, which is a great shame. Yes, I can. Graham Pitchfork. He was a British RAF officer. That's a good book because it talks about escapes. It talks about the gadgets. Talks about the agencies. It's the whole story. It's not just gadgets or just escapes, but there are so many different books on escapes. But a really good book for talking about MI9 and the whole escape thing is actually the MI9 book by Foote and Langley. That's a great book, and you can buy them secondhand pretty cheap, but the story is great. It's a pretty thick book, talks all about the formation of MI9, about First World War, about the gadgets, about prisoners, about everything. It's a great book.
Or you can just buy this one.
Which we all love.
Yeah, I'll buy that one. Yeah.
Phil, have you read Neil Bascom's The Escape Artists?
I may have done, and the reason I caveat that is that when I was writing my own book, I read so many books on escape because you can never use one source, and actually a lot of sources just contradict each other. So I wanted to try and get a rounded picture of what people say, and then I went to the National Archives and looked at the MI9 records, spoke to people from Ms. X, excuse me, and so yeah, I read so many. To be honest, I couldn't even list them.
It's a little.
Actually, they are listed in the back of my book in the bibliography. So.
Great. Well, I want to thank you both for an incredible conversation. And I heard even in the Q&A that a 9-year-old was enjoying it a lot. So thanks for not being, thanks for reaching us where we needed to be today. Now we know how to escape from, prison camps, but let's hope sometime we can escape from this quarantine. We have lots of programs for young people, people of all ages. Please check our website if you're enjoying our programs and you feel like contributing to our mission resilience. That would mean a lot to us. And we want to show you one final thing. You can leave if you wish, but we have a fabulous clip selected by Alexis and Phil. It is a humorous clip from the two Ronnies about escape. So our faces will disappear and the video will come up. Everybody take care.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone. Stay safe.
All right. It's you, Carter. Sit down, please. There's no chair. Well, then stand. We don't run this place for your comfort, Carter. Now, just one or two things I would like you to know before you commence your stay here in Colditz. This is a top security prison. There's no escape. Do you understand? From now on, you're in the hands of superior prison officers. Should you attempt to escape, here is a list of the men you would have to deal with. Hauptmann Leitz, Sturmbannführer Schmeling, Standartenführer Häsler, Unterwebel Blattau, and Gruppenveranstalter Großler Pintwinkler. You understand all this?
Yes, luckily my father kept a delicatessen.
Really?
Yeah, that was before he was in show business.
Show business? Huh. I like show business. What did he do?
He was an escapologist.
Well, Flight Lieutenant Carter, I hope you won't entertain any sorts of escape from here, following in your father's footsteps. Because I can assure you, escape from Colditz is impossible. Come out, Carter. I promise you, you will not manage it. Now then, here is your prison number and the address to which a letter should be sent. It will be forwarded to your family via the Red Cross. Do you understand?
Yes, perfectly. You realize it's the duty of every officer to try and escape, don't you?
Of course I realize it, Flight Lieutenant. I just thought that I would save you a little time and energy. After all, I can think of many better ways of spending the time. Don't you agree?
I suppose you're right.